A rebellious gang of teenagers feel like causing some trouble. They go out at night, blackening their faces so no one will spot them. For no reason at all, these unruly kids just start cutting down trees, and after that, they find a rabbit warren and take a rabbit or two just because, well, because they feel like it. They take things a step further when they get into the town. And there, they pickpocket a man and take a watch, which in today's money is worth about 40 bucks. The last thing they do on this crime spree is mindlessly wreck a fish pond. The teens then hang up their gloves and call it a night, only to be arrested the next morning as they chow down on their porridge. Can you guess how many capital crimes they committed that night? Answer: a lot. In the late 17th century, there were around 50 crimes in England that were punishable by death. But by the end of the 18th century, that number was more like 220. One of the crimes those kids committed that could have seen them hanged was blackening their faces at night with the intent to commit a crime. Shoe polish was for shoes, not faces. They could have also been hanged for cutting down trees, stealing a rabbit, stealing something worth about 5 shillings or 40 bucks today, and they could have also faced the gallows for doing that destruction job on the fish pond. Some of those offenses, you will no doubt agree, are not exactly major crimes, but the English invented these strict measures because they thought it would prevent crimes from happening in the first place. Some people at the time said there was no other country on the planet where so many crimes were punishable by death. Being a teen back then was risky to say the least, at least if you were the kind who broke a few rules now and again. As you'll find out, things improved, but in the era of what's being called the time of the bloody code, things were pretty crazy. In the 60 years between 1770 and 1830, around 7,000 people were executed in England and Wales. When we say kids could get in serious trouble in England, we're not only talking about people in their late teens. A lot of actual children went to the gallows too. There's a recording at a church in England that tells us a girl by the name of Alice Glaston was hanged in 1546, and she was only 11 at the time. The information about that event doesn't tell us what crime she'd committed, but we're hoping she did more than steal someone's prized vegetable. Kids had no protections from hanging, and at one point in time you could read in the law that strong evidence of malice in a child of 7 to 14 years of age could result in them going to the gallows. During the hanging frenzy of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, quite a few kids were hanged for crimes such as breaking into a house, stealing from a shop owner, or even forgery. And while other teens were executed for worse crimes such as murder. Let's now have a look at when hanging started, when it went disastrously wrong, and how it ended. Well, mostly ended. You might be surprised to hear that this kind of punishment is still around in some places. Hanging as an execution wasn't exactly a science when it first came about. There's evidence of hanging in Roman law, and you can see that it happened in ancient Greece as well. You can also read that it was often the go-to form of capital punishment as early as the 5th century in England. There's a history of hanging as a form of capital punishment all over the world, so it's better if we concentrate on one place. England seems to be the place to start because those guys perfected the procedure. By the time the 12th century came about in England, hanging was the #1 form of execution. Sure, they had burning at the stake as an option, and the very worst of criminals might find themselves being sentenced to being drawn and quartered, but hanging to death was by far the most popular way to kill a criminal. In the beginning, hanging was a simple affair. The person to be hanged would be tied in a noose, which was often fixed to a crossbeam that was attached to 2 vertical beams. That's the way it stayed in the early centuries and throughout the medieval period. But things called human rights started to change the process. At the end of the 18th century, people started questioning whether small crimes should result in hanging. It seemed rather unfair to some progressives that someone should go to the gallows for petty theft from a store or impersonating someone else. Times were changing, but we should say England wasn't exactly modernizing at high speed. In 1776, a newspaper in England called the Hereford Journal reported about the hanging of a 15-year-old girl named Susanna Underwood. She was sent to the gallows for the crime of burning down a barn. But rather than the newspaper writing about how terrible it was to execute someone so young for a crime that wasn't that bad, it criticized her for her bad manners. The stubborn girl had refused to shake the hand of her master before she was hanged, wrote the newspaper. Tut tut. Young folks would still get hanged for years to come. But in the 19th century, the government started commuting more capital crimes and lessening the ridiculous number of offenses for which someone could go to the gallows. It wasn't until 1908 that laws were passed saying anyone under the age of 16 couldn't get the death penalty. And on the run-up to that date, the crimes for a death sentence were limited to what would be considered major ones today, such as murder, treason, or spying. In 1839, the English did their last beheading and quartering spectacle, and so the way forward from there was mostly death by hanging. While all this was going on, some people wanted to improve the way people were hanged. In the past, there was a goalpost structure and also the structure that looks a bit like the way you play the game Hangman. This was called gibbeting. But as the 19th century got underway, it was seen as a somewhat old-school method. The people who were hanged this way might have also been fastened in chains, but the British government abolished this around the same time people were wondering how to hang a person with a little more humanity, if that's even possible. The style of hanging that was used was called the short drop. It was about as basic as hanging can get. You've all heard the expression "to kick the bucket," and that's kinda what a short drop consisted of. A person stood on a small platform, his head fastened in a noose, and that platform was then removed from under the feet of the person. Ouch. It was painful, and death was not fast. And thankfully, some kind-hearted people came up with better ways to hang a person. It was an Irish scientist named Samuel Houghton that came up with a better way. And in 1866, his paper titled "On Hanging, Considered from a Mechanical and Physiological Point of View" was published to a lot of fanfare. This guy would go on to serve on the Capital Sentences Committee, and he devised a way in which a person would die quickly from a broken neck, not strangulation. He worked out that the standard drop between 4 and 6 feet should be enough to do the trick, and the person would die quickly. It didn't always work out right, though, and so the British Home Office worked on a way to make the drop more measured and effective. The condemned man or woman's weight would be compared to an official table of drops to determine the exact height they should use. In 1888, if you were 182 pounds, your drop from the scaffold would have been 6 feet 11 inches. This was achieved by way of a handy trapdoor, which the condemned was forced to stand over. When it went right, the hanging would result in the dislocation of the vertebrae and often the rupturing of the jugular vein. When it went wrong, such as when the drop was too much, the person's head would come off, and that wasn't what the people wanted to see. Execution was a public spectacle after all, and this actually happened lots of times, such as in a famous case in 1901 involving U.S. outlaw Tom Edward Ketchum. His rope was too long, and off came his head. Sometimes the contraption just didn't work at all, with the most famous case being that of the so-called man they couldn't hang. They tried 3 times to hang John Babacombe Lee, and each time they failed. The trapdoor just wouldn't open. So after 3 grueling attempts, they just gave up. The guy had been through enough. He was imprisoned after the hanging debacle and some years later, released. Around this time, many countries were working on their hanging technique because a headless criminal just didn't look good. In 1930, a woman named Eva Dugan was hanged in Arizona, and that really turned out to be a dark day for all involved. The science didn't work for Eva, and she was decapitated. Maybe even worse is the fact that her head rolled in the direction of nearby public spectators. At the sight of that, 3 men and 2 women fainted. The science proved difficult, and hangings went wrong time and again. In Canada in 1919, a man named Antonio Spracage was hanged, and it took 1 hour and 11 minutes before he finally expired, and the surgeons present declared the man dead. The British hangman Albert Pierrepoint hanged hundreds of people in the first part of the 20th century, and he was quite serious about his job. Sometimes the entire hanging process from the man leaving his cell to actually being hanged would be completed in a matter of seconds. The faster it was, the less distress was caused to the condemned, or at least that was the theory. For Pierrepoint, it was of the greatest importance to give the condemned person some amount of dignity, and certainly not botch the job and cause them to suffer. After his retirement, Pierrepoint stated that he wasn't sure the death penalty worked. He said, "If hanging is said to be a deterrent, I cannot agree. There have been murders since the beginning of time, and we shall go on looking for deterrence until the end of time." He said that he was not sure he ever prevented anyone from murdering. As you might expect, Pierrepoint took a lot of flack for this. His longtime assistant wasn't too keen on what he was saying, stating, "I just couldn't believe it. When you've hanged more than 680 people, it's a hell of a time to find out you do not believe capital punishment achieves anything. Maybe if hanging criminals is the order of the day, and if you think you're the right man for the job, and can cause the least amount of distress and pain, then you should do the job." The last 2 people to be hanged in the UK were a pair named Gwen Evans and Peter Allen in 1964. They'd killed a man and got away with some cash, which amounted to the grand total of about $13. Things went to the plan on the day of the execution, at least, with the assistant hangman calling it a run-of-the-mill execution. Hanging then disappeared from most countries around the world. The last public hanging in the US happened in 1936, although some states still had hanging on their list of possible methods of execution for quite some time to come. In 1996, Billy Bailey was the last man ever to be hanged in the US. He was a big guy, weighing about 220 pounds. With that in mind, officials estimated the correct drop to be 5 feet. Bailey had actually chosen hanging as the way to go, although as of 2019 it's only New Hampshire where this is still possible in the US. When the day came, he had no final words. He stood on the scaffold on a cold night at the Delaware Correctional Center and had his ankles chained. A hood was put over his head and the noose was fastened under his chin. The warden then took a step backward and pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened and the rope with Billy on the end of it became taut about 10 feet from the ground. His prison jacket flapped in the cold wind as his body rotated one way and then the other. The execution was said to have gone without complication, although the man's pulse beat for around 11 minutes. The heart goes on even when the person is assumed to have no thoughts or pain left, but then again, no one will ever know what those last few moments dangling from a rope are like. We think after that, you might need a bit of cheering up. So we have 2 shows for you that should make you laugh and bring some light back into your world. Have a look at these 2 hilarious videos. I spent 7 days in bed and this is what happened, or for a different kind of humor, why flat earthers are dead wrong.